This brings us to the problem of Chinese logic, which is based on the Chinese conception of truth. Truth, according to the Chinese, can never be proved, it can only be suggested. Zhuangzi long ago pointed out the subjectivity of knowledge in his Chiwulin. In an argument between you and me, you think you have got the better of me, and I will not admit your superiority. Then, are you really right, and I really wrong? I think I have got the better of you, and you will not admit my superiority. Then, am I really right, and you really wrong? Or perhaps are we both right, or perhaps are we both wrong? This you and I cannot know. Thus, we are encircled in darkness. And who is going to establish the truth? If we let a man who agrees with you establish it, then he already agrees with you. So how could he establish it? If we let one who agrees with me establish the truth, then he already agrees with me. So how could he establish it? If we let one who disagrees with both of us establish the truth, then he already disagrees with both of us. So how could he establish it? If we let one who agrees with both of us establish the truth, then he already agrees with both of us. So how could he establish it? Thus, you and I and other people cannot know the truth. And how can we wait for the other one? According to this theory of knowledge, truth cannot be proved, although it may be grasped by the mind in a dialectic without words. One knows it is so without knowing why it is so. Tao, or truth, is that which we know not the manner of. It can therefore be felt only by a sort of intuitive perception. The Chinese, without all consciously accepting this Zhuangzian epistemology, essentially agree with it. Instead of relying on logic, which is never developed as a science, they rely on the perhaps healthier common sense. Anything like cogent reasoning is unknown in Chinese literature, for the Chinese inherently disbelieve in it. Consequently, no dialectic has been evolved, and the scientific treatise as a literary form is unknown. Bernhard Karlgren recently wrote a paper showing the fallacies of many arguments used by Chinese higher critics in proving the genuineness or spuriousness of ancient works. Some of the mistakes really seem childish, but they only seem so after the application of the Western method. A Chinese never writes a treatise of 10,000 or even 5,000 words to establish a point. He puts down only a note about it, leaving it to be sustained or disproved by posterity on its intrinsic merit. That is why Chinese scholars always bequeath to us so many collections of notebook called shuipi or pichur, consisting of unclassified paragraphs in which opinions on the authorship of literary works and corrections of errors in historical records are mixed up with accounts of Siamese twins, fox spirits, and sketches of a red bearded hero or a centipede eating recluse. A Chinese author presents you with one or two arguments and then states his conclusion. In reading him, you seldom see him arriving at the conclusion, for the arguments and the evidences are never long, but you see in a flash that he already has it. The best of such notebooks, like the Chi Lu of Ku Yanwu, beginning of the 17th century, established their reputation not by their logic but by the essential correctness of their statements, which can only be proved or disproved by posterity. The writing of 2 or 3 lines in Ku's notebook was sometimes the result of years of research and investigation, which was scientific enough, and the determination of A single point of historic fact might have involved repeated trips and an encyclopedic erudition, but his errors are difficult to check, and the fact that he is correct is not immediately visible and can only be appreciated because no writer in 3 centuries after him has been able to establish a point against him. Thus, we see an opposition of logic versus common sense, which takes the place of inductive and deductive reasoning in China. Common sense is often saner because the analytic reasoning looks at truth by cutting it up into various aspects, thus throwing them out of their natural bearings, while common sense seizes the situation as a living whole. Women have a more robust common sense than men, and in times of any emergency, I always depend on the judgment of a woman rather than that of a man. They have a way of sizing up a situation in its totality without being distracted by its individual aspects. In the best Chinese novels, like The Red Chamber Dream and The Ye Sao Pao and Uncouth Old Man's Chats, the women are pictured as the soundest judges of situations, and their speech has a way of putting it in a rounded whole which is extremely fascinating. Logic without such common sense is dangerous because when a man holds an opinion, it is easy enough for him with his academic brain to evolve arguments A, B, and C to his own satisfaction. And yet, he may be like the scholar Mr. Casaubon in Middlemarch, who fails to perceive what every man could perceive in the life of his own wife. This religion of common sense has a philosophic basis. It is interesting to note that the Chinese do not judge the correctness of proposition by the appeal to reason alone, but by the double appeal to reason and to human nature. The Chinese word for reasonableness is Jingli, which is composed of two elements, Renxing, or human nature, and Li, Tianli, or eternal reason. Qing represents the flexible human element, while Li represents the immutable law of the universe. Out of the combination of these two factors comes the standard of judgment for a course of action or an historical thesis. Something of this distinction may be seen in the English contrast between reason and reasonableness. It was Aristotle, I believe, who said that man is a reasoning but not a reasonable being. Chinese philosophy admits this, but adds that man should try to be a reasonable and not merely a reasoning being. By the Chinese, reasonableness is placed on a higher level than reason. For while reason is abstract, analytical, idealistic, and inclined towards logical extremes, the spirit of reasonableness is always more realistic, more human, in closer touch with reality, and more truly understanding and appreciative of the correct situation. For a Westerner, it is usually sufficient for a proposition to be logically sound. For a Chinese, it is not sufficient that a proposition be logically correct, but it must be at the same time in accord with human nature. In fact, to be in accord with human nature, to be Tianqing, is a greater consideration than to be logical, for a theory could be so logical as to be totally devoid of common sense. The Chinese are willing to do anything against reason, but they will not accept anything that is not plausible in the light of human nature. This spirit of reasonableness and this religion of common sense have a most important bearing on the Chinese ideal of life, a result in the doctrine of the golden mean which I shall discuss in the following chapter. 5. Intuition. Nevertheless, this type of thinking has its limitations too, for the logic of common sense can only be applied to human affairs and actions. It cannot be applied to the solution of the riddles of the universe. One can use reasonableness to settle a dispute, but not to locate the relative positions of the heart and liver or determine the function of the pancreatic juice. Hence, in divining nature's mysteries and the secrets of the human body, the Chinese have to resort largely to intuition. Strangely enough, they have intuitively felt the heart to be on the right and the liver to be on the left side of the human chest. An erudite Chinese scholar whose voluminous Yu Shui are widely read came across a copy of Human Anatomy translated by the Jesuits Jacobus Rowe, James Terence, and Nicholas Longobardi, and finding that in the book the heart is placed on the left and the liver on the right, decided that Westerners have different internal organs from the Chinese, and deduced therefrom the important conclusion that since their internal organs are different, therefore their religion must be also different. This deduction is in itself a perfect example of intuitive reasoning, and hence only Chinese whose internal organs are imperfect could possibly become Christian converts. The erudite scholar slyly remarked that if the Jesuits only knew this fact, they would not be interested in preaching Christianity in China and making converts of half normal beings. Such assertions are made in perfect seriousness, and in fact are typical of Chinese intuition in the realms of natural science and human physiology. One begins to believe that there is something after all in the scientific method, for with this method, though one might be seriously concerned in the findings that the primary function of sugar and the manufacture of ice cream is to sweeten it, yet one could be saved from the other sort of puerile thinking represented by the author of the above notebooks. He could at least have felt the palpitation of his heart by his own hand, but evidently the Chinese scholar never descended to manual labor. Free thus from stupid drudgery in the use of his eyes and his hands, and having a naive faith in the power of his intuition, the Chinese scholar goes about explaining the mysteries of the human body and the universe to his own satisfaction. The whole science of Chinese medicine and physiology is based on the Taoistic philosophy of the 5 elements: gold, wood, water, fire, and earth. The human body is in itself a symbol of the universe and its composition. The kidneys represent the water element, the stomach represents the earth element, the liver represents the fire element, the lungs represent the gold element, and the heart represents the wood element. Not that this medicine does not work in practice. A man suffering from high blood pressure is considered to have too warm a liver fire, while a man suffering from indigestion may be referred to as having too much earth, and a laxative is used to encourage the function of the kidneys by way of helping the water element, and the indigestion is usually cured. If a man is suffering from nervous trouble, he should drink a lot of water and use palliatives, so that the kidney water will go up and dampen a little the liver fire, and thus help maintain in him a more equitable temper. There is no doubt that the Chinese medicine works. The quarrel is only with its diagnosis. Here enter the survivals of savage traits in Chinese thinking. Unchecked by a scientific method, intuition has free room and often borders on a naive imagination. Some kinds of Chinese medicine are based on a mere play of words or on some fantastic association of thought. The toad who has wrinkled skin is used in the cure of skin troubles, and a peculiar kind of frog that lives in cool, deep ponds on hillsides is supposed to have a cooling effect on the bodily system. For the last 2 years, the local papers in Shanghai have been full of advertisements of a certain long-shaped plant which is produced in Sichuan and recommended as the best cure for tuberculosis. And this goes on in an uninterrupted series until we come to the popular belief that a schoolboy should not eat chicken's claws, lest he develop the habit of scratching the pages of his book. The superstitious belief in the power of words may be traced in all departments of life, for here we are dealing neither with logic nor with common sense, but with a survival of the savage state of mind which does not distinguish and is not interested in distinguishing playful fancy from serious truth. The bat and the deer are popular motives for embroidery work because the word bat, fu, is a homonym for luck, and the word deer, lu, is a homonym for official power. The Chinese bride and bridegroom have, after the wedding ceremony, a dinner, adua, consisting of a pig's heart because they are thus going to have the same heart, which is the word for harmony. It is difficult to say how much of it is serious belief and how much of it is light, playful fancy. Certain taboos are evidently taken quite seriously, for the boatman will look troubled when you turn over the fish at dinner in the boat, which suggests the overturning of the boat itself. He does not quite know whether it is true or not, but so people say, and he is not interested in undertaking a research to verify it. It is a state of mind that belongs to the borderland of truth and fiction, where truth and fiction are pleasurably and poetically mixed, as in a dreamer's tale. Imagination. The naivete we must try to understand, for it brings us to the world of the Chinese imagination and Chinese religion. By religion, I mean a good heaven and a hot hell and real living spirits, and not the kingdom within you of the Boston Unitarians, or the belief in the impersonal and amorphous power in and around us, which makes for righteousness of Matthew Arnold. The world of imagination is not confined to the illiterate. Confucius himself exhibited a certain naivete regarding the spirits when he said, if one were to try to please the god of the southwest corner of the house, it would be preferable to try to please the god of the kitchen stove. He spoke of the spirits with an ease of mind which was truly charming. Offer sacrifices to the spirits as if the spirits were present, and respect the spirits but keep them at a distance. He was willing to let the spirits exist if they would let him go his own way. Han Yu, the great Confucianist of the Tang Dynasty, continued this naive attitude. He was officially reprimanded and compelled to go to the neighborhood of modern Shuatou to serve as a magistrate, and when the district was suffering from an invasion of crocodiles, he wrote a high-flown sacrificial appeal to the crocodiles. The crocodiles seemed to appreciate his literary style, for he was one of the best writers in China's history, and according to his own testimony, they disappeared from the district. It would be futile to ask if he sincerely believed in it or not. To ask that question is completely to misunderstand the situation, for his reply would most probably be, how can I know it is true? How can you know it is untrue? It was agnosticism which openly admitted the impossibility of settling the question with our mental powers, and therefore brushed it aside. Han Yu's was a powerful mind, and he was not superstitious, for he was the man who wrote the famous essay dissuading the emperor from sending a delegation to bring back the Buddha's bones from India. I'm sure he was half laughing when he composed that sacrificial appeal to the crocodiles. There have been other powerful minds, more rationalistic in temperament, like that of Sima Wukong of the following dynasty, who tried to disprove the Buddhistic hell by asking why the Chinese people never dreamed of hell until they heard of Buddhism. But such rationalism is not typical of the Chinese mind. To me, the most characteristic creatures of the Chinese imagination are the lovely female ghosts that the Chinese scholar spins out of his imagination, such as those told in the Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio. The stories are about the female ghosts and spirits of wronged and disgraced women who possess the body of some maidservant and thus communicate their complaints to the living, and the dead sweetheart who returns to her lover and bears him children. It is these stories with their human touch which are most loved by the Chinese people, for the Chinese ghosts are wonderfully human, and the female ghosts are wonderfully lovely too. They love and become jealous and take part in the ordinary human life. It is not the kind of ghost that scholars need fear when they are alone at night in their studies, for when the lamp is burning low and the scholar has fallen asleep, he hears the noise of a silken dress and opens his eyes to see a demure maiden of 16 or 17 with a wistful look and a serene air looking and smiling at him. She is usually a passionate creature, for I have no doubt these stories are the wish fulfillment of the solitary scholar, but she can bring him money and help him through poverty by all sorts of cunning wiles. She can nurse him through sickness with more gentleness than an average modern nurse. What is stranger still, she will sometimes try to save money for him and will wait patiently for him during his months or years of absence. She can therefore be chaste as well. The period of this cohabitation may last a few days or weeks, or it may extend to a generation until she has borne him children who, after their success in examinations, come back for their mother and then find that the gorgeous mansion has disappeared and in its place is an old grave with a hole underground where lies a dead old mother fox, for she is only one of those fox spirits the Chinese delight to tell about. Sometimes she leaves behind a note saying that she was sorry to leave them, but that she was a fox and only wanted to enjoy human life. And now, since she has seen them prosper, she is grateful and hopes they will forgive her. This is typical of the Chinese imagination, which, without soaring aloft to godlike heights, invests the creatures of its mind with human passions and human sorrows. It has the pagan virtue of accepting the imaginary with the real. It has no desire for a world perfectly rationalized and completely explained. This quality of the Chinese imagination is so little known that I will give here a translation of a tale, the tale of Zhenyang, handed down from the Tang Dynasty. I don't know whether the story is true or not, but the affair happened in the years around AD 690 during the reign of the Empress Wu Ho. Our novels, dramas, and scholars' works are full of this type of story, in which the supernatural is made believable because it is made human. Zhenyang was the daughter of Mr. Chang Yi, an official in Hunan. She had a cousin by the name of Wang Zhou, who was a brilliant and handsome young man. They had grown up together from childhood, as her father was very fond of the young boy he had said that he would take Wang Shou as his son-in-law. This promise they had both heard, and as she was the only child and they were very close together, their love grew from day to day. They were now grown-up young people and even had intimate relationships with each other. Unfortunately, her father was the only man who failed to perceive this. One day, a young official came to beg for her hand from her father, and, ignoring or forgetting his early promise, he consented. Zhenyang, torn between love and filial piety, was ready to die with grief, while the young man was so disgusted that he decided he would go abroad rather than stay and see his sweetheart become the bride of another person. So he made up a pretext and informed his uncle that he had to go away to the capital. As the uncle could not persuade him to stay, he gave him money and presents and prepared a farewell feast for him. Wang Shou, sad to take leave of his lover, was thinking it all over while he partook of the feast, and he told himself that it was best to go rather than remain to carry on a hopeless romance. So Wang Shou set out on a boat of an afternoon, and before he had gone a few miles, it was already dark, and he told the boatman to tie up the boat along shore and rest for the night. That night he could not sleep, and toward midnight he heard the sound of quick footsteps approaching. In a few minutes the sound had drawn near the boat. He got up and inquired, "Who is there at this hour of the night?" "It is I, Zhenyang," was the reply. Surprised and delighted beyond his expectations, he led her down the boat, and there she told him that she had hoped to be his wife, that her father had been unfair to him, and that she could not bear parting from him. She was afraid, too, that he, lonely and traveling in strange parts, might be driven to take his own life. So she had braved the censure of society and the anger of her parents and come to follow him wherever he should go. Thus, they were happy together and continued their journey to Sichuan. 5 years passed happily, and she bore him 2 sons. But they had no news from the family, and she was daily thinking of her parents. It was the only thing that marred their happiness. She did not know whether her parents were living and well or not, and one night she began telling Wang Shou how unhappy she was, and that since she was the only child, she felt guilty of great filial impiety to leave the old parents thus. "This is your filial piety," said her husband. "I am with you in thinking this way. But it seems that now, after 5 years have passed, surely they are not still angry with us. Why not go home?" Zhenyang was overjoyed to hear this, and so they made preparations to go home with their 2 children. When the boat had reached her hometown, Wang Shou said to Zhenyang, "I do not know what state of mind your parents are in, so let me go along first to find out." His heart was palpitating as he drew near his father-in-law's house. On seeing his father-in-law, Wang Shou knelt down and kowtowed and begged for forgiveness. On hearing this, Chang Yi was greatly surprised and said, "What are you talking about? Zhenyang has been lying unconscious in bed for these last 5 years." "What are you talking about? Zhenyang has been lying unconscious in bed since you left. She has never even left her bed." "I'm not lying," said Wang Shou. "She is well and waiting in the boat." Chang Yi did not know what to think, so he sent 2 maidservants to see Zhenyang. They saw her sitting well dressed and happy in the boat, and she even told the servants to convey her love to her parents. Bewildered, the 2 maidservants ran home to make their report, and Chang Yi was still more greatly puzzled. Meanwhile, who was lying in bed in her chamber had heard of the news, and it seemed her illness was gone, and there was a light in her eyes. She rose up from her bed and dressed herself before her mirror. Smiling without saying a word, she came straight to the boat. She who was in the boat was starting for home, and they met on the river bank. When the two came close together, their bodies melted into one shape, and their dresses were double. Then there appeared the old Zhenyang, as young and as lovely as ever. Both her parents were overjoyed, but they bade their servants keep the secret and not tell the neighbors about it, in order to avoid gossip. So no one except the close relatives of the Tang family ever knew of this strange happening. Wang Shou and Zhenyang lived on as husband and wife for over 40 years before they died. It is perhaps well that the world is not completely explained and that there is some room for this type of imagination. The proper use of imagination is to give beauty to the world, whereas in the moral life, human intelligence is used to convert the world into a place of contentment for human existence. So, in the artistic life, the gift of imagination is used to cast over the commonplace workaday world a veil of beauty and make it throb with our aesthetic enjoyment. In China, the art of living is one with the arts of painting and poetry, as Li Yutang at the end of the 17th century expressed it in a dramatic passage. First, we look at the hills in the painting, then we look at the painting in the hills. The imagination, by its contemplation of sorrow and poverty, turns sorrow and poverty into beauty, as we see so clearly in Tufu's poetry, where beauty resides in the huts, in the grasshoppers, and cicadas' wings, and, strangest of all, in the rocks, too. The Chinese alone in the world would paint a piece of jagged rock and hang it on the wall for daily contemplation and enjoyment. These rocks, they are not the carved stones of Venice or of Florence, but the rugged and untamed works of nature, still retaining the rough rhythm of their natural appearance, from which our aesthetic enjoyment is drawn. I think the enjoyment of the rhythm of common rock is the last refinement of the Chinese mind. Indeed, the Chinese mind is as keen to detect the beauty in a common pebble as it is anxious to squeeze the last ounce of happiness from an insecure and fate-ruled world. That painting of a solitary rugged rock, or of a cat watching a grasshopper he would hang on his wall and contemplate, although a civil war might be raging outside his very doors. To find beauty in common life, that is the value of the Wordsworthian and the Chinese imagination. For Wordsworth is the most Chinese in spirit of all English poets. If you do not run away from the raindrops, you will find them most beautiful, said Xiao Shiwei at the end of the Ming Dynasty. He was speaking of the familiar style of writing diaries, but it was not only a literary doctrine, it was a doctrine of life.